By the word religion, I've seen the lunacy of fanatics of every denomination be called the will of God. I've seen too much religion in the eyes of too many murderers. Holiness is in right action and courage on behalf of those who cannot defend themselves. And goodness, what God desires, is here, and what you decide to do every day, you will be a good man.
It's a dangerous business.
Going out your door, you step onto the road, and if you don't keep your feet, there's no knowing where you might be swept off to.
This is your nautical lantern on the dangerous seas of darkness. Let's push off from the placid shore of the status quo and explore what's beyond the horizon. I am your host, BT, and this is Truth and Shadow, your podcast of the supernatural.
Ave Maria, gratia plena, Dominus tecum, benedicta tu in mulieribus, et benedictus fructus ventris tui, Iesus. Sancta Maria, Mater Dei, ora pro nobis peccatoribus, nunc et in hora mortis nostrae. Amen.
There's a chapel in Europe, I won't say which one, where behind glass, older than the English that I'm speaking, lies a fragment of bone. Human bone. Supposedly from a saint, people come by the hundreds each year to pray before it, to touch the glass, to whisper prayers into the silence. Now, depending on who you are, what you believe, and how badly you want the world to make sense, you might look at that bone and see a simple thing. Calcified tissue, useless, long removed from the living. You might say this is superstition, maybe even say it's fraud. But let me tell you what I see. I see memory, made manifest. I see longing. And I see the deep psychic need of a species terrified of meaninglessness, reaching into death and pulling out a shard of hope. I see in this relic something more sacred. More sacred than logic would allow. Relics are strange things. A saint's tooth, a bloody garment, a splinter of wood said to come from the cross. What about a bullet-ridden Bible carried in a soldier's breast pocket? Dare I say, in our modern myth-making, Elvis's guitar, Kennedy's limousine, or a flag flown at Ground Zero? You know, all of these in their own ways are relics. But the question is, what gives a relic its power? Is it the object itself, the physical material? Or is it something else entirely? Something older, deeper maybe, carved into the human heart, something that whispers to us in our dreams? Now, the modern mind has been trained to bow before microscopes, mathematics, algorithms. It wants to scoff, but the soul knows. But let's back up a little bit. Scientifically, anthropologists will tell you that early humans were drawn to objects that meant something. Stones shaped like animals, bones that carried markings or tools buried with the dead. These weren't just tools, they became totems. They were talismans, if you will. They were objects of the threshold, of liminal spaces. And the moment a thing becomes more than its function is the moment it becomes a relic. Therefore, relics are the charged symbols of another time, like a mosquito caught in amber. They are not merely historical artifacts, they are archetypical objects, containers of presence, of story, of mystery. They are the icons of rupture. They're breaks in the seamless fabric of the mundane world. They're here reminding us that something supernatural, something holy or haunted or both, once happened here. A relic may say something like, "This mattered. Something happened that was not ordinary, and this is what remains." But I think there's something more here. It's not just the relic itself, it's the people who believe in it. Their faith, their awe, their willingness to bow not just before the object, but before the idea that the divine can inhabit the physical. That God can touch a thing and leave a fingerprint of divinity. And this is where things get dangerous. Because belief is a force. It's a metaphysical gravity. Enough belief can move mountains, raise armies, topple empires. So it was never just the Ark of the Covenant. It was the belief in the Ark. It was never just the true cross. It was the blood, the legend, the presence that clung to it. We are creatures who deep down want contact with the divine. And sometimes the only way we know how to find it is through something we can hold. Let me ask you a question. Have you ever held an object and felt something pass through you? Let's say you were reading a letter from a dead loved one, or holding a wedding ring, or in your hand were the dog tags of a beloved soldier. What is that feeling? Is that nostalgia? Memory? Is it an emotional resonance? Maybe it's more than that. Could it be the soul reaching across time to make contact with something it once knew? Is it the object remembering you? In Jungian terms, relics are charged archetypical vessels, symbols so soaked in meaning that they shimmer with so-called psychic energy. They become mirrors for the soul, symbols of the sacred, but also of death, suffering, hope, transcendence. And they remind us that the world is not just what it seems. Well, the danger, and rightly so, of course, is idolatry. The object becomes more important than the reality it points to. But that doesn't mean the object is meaningless. Quite the opposite. It means we're not ready for what it really contains because, well, if relics are real, and I believe that they are, then they're dangerous. They undo the neat boundaries of our secular scientific minds. They pull us into a world that's holy and alive. They are proof that something once happened, that a life was lived, that miracles broke through into our world, that something beyond explanation touched the earth and left a mark. So in this episode, we're going to dig into a relic. Not as a museum piece, but maybe as a metaphysical key. We're going to ask, what makes a relic powerful? Is it the material, the story, the ritual surrounding it? Or is it the belief that binds all these things together? And if so, does that make us, ourselves, relics? Are we the vessels of meaning? We who are broken? Are we blessed containers of the holy? In the end, I don't think relics are about the past. I think they're messages to the future. Proof that someone, somewhere, believed the veil could be pierced, that heaven could touch earth. So, light a candle, take off your shoes, sit quietly. This isn't a lecture, it's a vigil. Let's open the reliquary and see what still lives inside. In the darkened halls of a stone abbey, a reliquary gleams with promise, or a warning. It has no voice, and yet it commands armies, it works miracles, and it kills. The year is 1066, a sacred object is stolen, smuggled, and delivered into the hands of a man who will become a king. There was an ambition that drove William of Normandy to Hastings, or the will of something older. Today we're going to descend into the tangled corridors of medieval politics, religious fervor, and sacred thefts, because in this story, faith isn't just belief, it's a currency, and the saints, they might not be resting in peace. Our guest is author Mark McPherson, whose novel The Conquest of Foy doesn't just retell history, it resurrects it, and with it the question that should unsettle us all. What happens when holy power falls into unholy hands? Mark, welcome to Truth and Shadow Podcast.
Thanks very much. Thank you for having me.
Now, Mark, before we dive basically into your novel here, into Relics and Kingdoms, I'd love to begin with the man behind the myth. What first drew you to history, not just as fact, but as story?
Yeah, thank you. It's a good question. I guess it would be in the early 2000s. This is what drew me to history. Is in the early 2000s, I was in England with a friend, and I went for a walk and stumbled on. Just by going for a walk, I was at the location of the Battle of Bosworth, which is where a medieval king famously died, and it just made me go, wow, I can't believe I'm standing on such enormous history. Even though I'm in Australia and we have an enormous traditional owner history, it's different because being from my heritage, being Scottish. I felt more of a connection to this place where I was, and that just got me reading. As soon as I got home from this trip, I started reading up on medieval history, stuff that I never got in school, because growing up in school in Australia, you get Australian history, which is not as exciting as European history.
Sure.
So I started reading novels mainly. It was historical fiction which got me into it. Next thing you know, I'm watching, the famous art historian and Professor Simon Sharma, and he released in the early 2000s a BBC documentary called A History of Britain, and his use of the English language just got me more keen, and the way he explained history made it interesting. So that's how I got interested in history, and that got me started in wanting to write something that I wanted to read.
Sure. And then what about you personally? What kind of background do you have, and the interests that you've got?
Yeah, so I obviously born in Sydney, Australia. I have two older brothers, and I was born to a family of deaf parents. So both of my parents are deaf. So Auslan, which is the Australian version of your American ASL, Auslan is the Australian sign language. That was my first language. And I grew up in a pretty staunchly Salvation Army family, very Protestant, very Salvation Army Christianity or spirituality is very similar to Baptist, just with a uniform. And I'm sure you guys in America are aware of the Salvation Army. So I was in the Salvation Army up until the age of 12, until I discovered a Pentecostal church with my mother. And it was the beginnings. That Pentecostal church was a very small, kind of maybe 300 or 400 people church in the Hills region of Sydney. And that church became one of the largest Protestant churches in the world. And you don't need to look up the name of that. So I was in that church for 18 years until my wife and I got married in 2005. And my wife and I, we found it difficult being a part of a megachurch, one of 10,000 people, So we moved to an Anglican church, a small little Vicar of Dibley parish. And so I've been Anglican since 2005. But when I started writing my book, I started digging into history, and when you dig into church history, you can't help but dig into Catholic history. And as a massive Protestant, thinking that Christianity began 500 years ago, you get this shock of, wow, this stuff is really amazing and really helpful. Because I was taught my whole time, like as a kid, I was taught, don't play with the Catholic kids down the road, play with the Baptist kids up the road. And I was always taught that Catholic spirituality is dangerous. And that was something that stuck with me until my late 20s, early 30s. And then when you start to realize that there was the richness and of a ancient spiritual practice that has its roots in Eastern Orthodox or Catholic faith, it just was mind-blowing to me as a very isolated Protestant. And I used to bag Catholics. I used to laugh at them. In my 20s, I used to just think it was hilarious that, I had a very incorrect view on things like Marian dogmas, things like transubstantiation in the Mass. I had very wrong views on a lot of things. And then when I started to read more, I started to understand more, I started to realize how patient God is with me. And I finished my book after 12 years of writing. It took me a long time.
Okay,
I got to the end of that and just, I didn't want to write anymore. I wanted to understand more about everything that I learned about the 11th century spirituality. And 11th century spirituality that you find in my book, which we can talk about later, is you can see in my writing in there is that I'm digging. I'm really digging for information here. And I wrote it in a way of what I found in all the research that I did, because for every page of writing, there's at least 15 pages of research. So I really wanted to understand the spirituality and the superstition, both sides, the good and the bad of 11th century religion in France and England. So that's about me. Sorry, I've gone too far with that.
No, that's okay. That's good. As much as you can give is really nice. I mean, in all of this, because you said, you'd begun writing your book in 2006. And I'm just curious if there was a moment or maybe a book that kind of lit the fire to get you to start writing this. I mean, something that made you say, it's, there's a story here. It feels forgotten and it needs to be told.
Yeah, it was definitely Simon Sharma's second episode on his documentary, which is called Conquest. So it's like a forgotten documentary now, but back in its day, he was really popular in England and in Australia. I'm not sure in America, but Simon Sharma kind of rose to fame. He was just a lonely professor then, until then, and BBC kind of tapped on his shoulder. And that story around the Norman conquest of England in 1066 is a beautiful and shocking story of brotherly betrayal. But there was a little bits in there that I discovered in his story, in his version of the history, and in my own reading, is that William of Normandy, who became later William the Conqueror, there was a little fact in there that made me go, hang on a sec, does anyone know more about that? And that fact was that he got the Pope's permission to use some sort of relic to be built into his armor as a guide and as a strength for him in the Battle of Hastings on October 14th, 1066. So, and I dug into that, and no one knows what that relic was. That relic was also used as a trick on Harold Godwinson 6 months earlier. So I read into what all the relics are in the area around Occitan or around Falaise in France. And the story that I've got in my book is an alternative history, to be fair, but I think it has the strongest case of being that relic, which is the relic of Saint Foy. So there you go.
So, I mean, there's something kind of unsettling about the idea that there could be a sacred relic that has its own agenda, if you will,
Yes, yes, of course there is.
that that it's not just, I mean, we obviously look at relics as symbols of faith, sacramentals of the faith, but I mean, this kind of thing grew into its own legend, really, with your like you said, it's a alternative history. So there's like this idea that you've kind of had to come up with the relic on your own a little bit. And so what was the inspiration here to kind of get that on your radar and start really making this into a thriller?
Yeah, so it is the practice of Virtus Sacra. So around the 11th century, I would say from the 9th to the 12th century, Virtus Sacra, which is the practice of relic theft or sacred theft. So there is a book on it. I've forgotten the name of the author, but there was a book in my research. There's pretty much the only book you can find. If you look up the word Virtus Sacra, you can find this wonderful history on it. Also, there is there's an 11th century guide for the Camino that I also used in my research, and that mentions the Virtus Sacra of Saint Foy. So Saint Foy's relics she was a 12-year-old girl from the 3rd century, who was martyred for her faith during the persecutions, and she lived in Agen, which is a little village in France, and her relics were buried there, and there was started to be some great miracles. And there's a 9th century passion story around that. Where her relics are today are in a very different place. So in Conques is a beautiful medieval village it's on the way to the Camino, and it's on the path, and pilgrims on their way to Santiago de Compostela would go through there to visit the relics of Foy. But Foy was not from Conques, she was from Agen. So Conques monks did steal those relics from Agen and put them in Conques, and that's where they remain. All I did is added another Virtus Sacra story where the relics were stolen from Conques, just like they stole it from Agen, and taken up to Falaise, which is in Normandy. Spoiler alert, the relics are eventually returned. So that's that practice of monks going in disguise, pretending to be novices, even though they're experienced monks from another monastery, and staying undercover for up to 10 years. This is true. There's evidence of it, and waiting until they got the opportune moment to steal this relic. Once they stole the relic and took it back to their senior monk and to their abbeys, they would have a negotiation that would take place where the place where it came from would admit that it was stolen. The reason why is you don't want to have two monasteries or two abbeys saying we have the relics of a saint, because that would lower the popularity of that saint and therefore lower your benefits. So they would say, "Oh, it's been stolen by this abbey, and we intend to get it back." So that whole practice of Virtus Sacra is just fascinating. I had read so much about it, and it is an amazing and also funny part of monasticism in the Middle Ages, because it's so anti, Jesus of Nazareth, and it's just hilarious, that they just almost prided themselves on these being successful in these thefts. It's completely disregarding the whole purpose of having a saint is learning from them and having their intercession, rather than enjoying the benefits of their relics. So
that does make it into quite an amusing kind of a comedy of errors, Anna.
Yes, it is. It's hilarious.
So I mean, in your story, the conquest, it takes place in basically a world where superstition, politics, theology are they're not like they are today, where they're like these separate little ideas, but they're more fused together. And I'm wondering, when you looked at that time period and you were really digging into it, what'd you find that showed how these individuals believed in the 11th century, or did they just basically admit that super? I mean, how was it that they allowed so much supernatural into their politics as it was compared,
Yeah,
if
that's a
we
really
looked
good
at
point.
today?
Well, it was in the centuries following, for the British monarchy, in the centuries following William of Normandy and William the Conqueror, is where you start to get the real battles between church and state. And when you get a battle between church and state, that is a battle between allegiances, between your allegiance to your monarch or your allegiance to a papacy. Um, and and that affects not just your politics. When you read up on people in Christendom around that time, it didn't just affect politics and affect who owned your land. It affected the imagination of the average pilgrim, the average serf, the average, farmer. It affected their spirituality. So having that power was a big deal, because it also, not only did it mean where you would put your pennies on Sunday or your mites, it also it changed where you would flock, where something like a you know Pope Urban II declared something later on, and it sparked an enormous change in who had allegiances where. So I just feel what the most of what I got around that time, the 11th century, to understand spirituality is around the pilgrimage to Santiago and the pilgrimage to Rome, because everyone was doing it, right? It was long before the Crusades, long before the Crusades sparked any kind of religious fervor. Um, so I wanted to understand what made people do pilgrimages, because it was really a peak. People were doing local pilgrimages to, say for example, Our Lady of Walsingham in England, and to Canterbury and things like that in England. And in France, they were doing them to Conques and things like that. But they would also take massive pilgrimages where they knew that they would likely die. And they were happy to die on pilgrimage or en route to Santiago or to Rome or to even Jerusalem. So they would be buried along the pilgrimage path. Now, that gave me the idea that proximity to something sacred, there's something that linked to their Messiah, was their spirituality. They wanted to be close to something. And that got me digging towards what was really the ultimate sacred item in Christendom at that time, which was still the body and blood of Christ.
So we throw around words today: faith, superstition. But if we look at 11th century France or even England, their belief, the belief of the people, wasn't just like this personal. It was structure. It was part of the entire
Of course.
body, the corporate body of the church. And so you were looking at Catholic spirituality. What did it look like back then? What did you come face to face with in the peoples that you started really digging into?
That is a really, really genuinely good question. When I first started investigating, I was going, okay, I've got to look into this because I need to, and this is ridiculous. So I needed to look into it. So it was difficult at first. It really was, because essentially this stuff was what I've always been taught as religion, not Christianity or Christian spirituality. It's just religion. So I put on those glasses when I first started. And as I dug further and further and further, I started to realize, no, this is personal. This is deep in the heart of the average pilgrim. This love and this zealous devotion is real, and it is fascinating. And with the little information they had, a lot of them couldn't read, and they would go to church, and they would, a lot of them would go to church just to see the bread at the time. They wouldn't even take communion because it was for the privileged few a lot of the times in some villages and towns where it was just for nobles. They would go and sit at the back and just wait until the bread was elevated, and then they'd go, yeah, cool, I've taken mass. Like, that's how much they loved it, is they just wanted to see it. And they would also, during Corpus Christi, they would have these amazing festivals and things like that, where just so they could see the sacrament, which is just fascinating. And I guess that's what I came across, is that desire to be close to the passion of Jesus, to be close to that day, not to relive it, but to almost like in a spiritual way connect to it. It's because I was always taught that the idea that that the body and blood is in the Catholic Mass is heretical, because what it does, it's redoing what Christ has already done, and that is not correct. That is not correct. It's more than that. Transubstantiation is not what I was taught that it was. So I wanted to understand deeply. So now when I finally got the scales away from my eyes and the judgment, I finally started to understand the beauty of experiencing and witnessing and thinking about, meditating on the passion of Christ every weekend at Mass, even though I never took it. So I started to turn up to Catholic Mass occasionally in the city, because I work in the city. My day job is in Sydney, and there's Catholic churches everywhere. And the beauty of Catholic churches, they're open every day from 7 till 6, 7 in the morning till 6. And they have Mass 3 or 4 times a day. So I would sit at the back and just experience and a lot of people would be already there half an hour before, doing this thing called Adoration of the Blessed Sacrament. And I read up on that, because I started to witness it. People just staring at this thing called a monstrance, which had a piece of bread in it. And I was like, what is this? What is this? Why are they worshipping this bread? And then you start to read about John chapter 6. And it blew my mind. It blew my mind. This stuff that never was preached from the pulpit in a megachurch. When you read it again and again, and you start to realize that Christ is the bread of life, and you start to understand that devotion. That devotion blew my mind. It really did. So I started to keep going, and that's what got me thinking. Yeah.
No, that's great. Yeah, we use words like reliquaries, monstrance. I mean, these are all common Catholic parlance for items. And if you were to describe them to your fellow Protestants or fellow readers, how would you go about describing not just what they are, but kind of how they're presented within the Catholic faith as you continue to read and discover that?
Yeah, that's a good question too. Well, a lot of the things that I grew up with in a what is called a Pentecostal or a charismatic church is you would hear the words, "The presence of the Lord is here." You'd hear that often, right? And it's thrown around like a magazine, right? It really is. And to be fair, that's people's spirituality, and I can understand that, and I'm not going to judge that. But it was thrown around a lot. And also, when the idea of a Catholic church building ever came up, you'd just go, "Oh, it's ridiculous! They don't need to build these huge Gothic things." And why are the churches so decadent? All you need is a building. God can be anywhere, and that is true, right? Fair enough. But when you understand that when people really do love Christ, they're going to dig further, and when they dig further, they realize that the body and blood of Jesus is with them. then you want to build something that I can understand that people would want to build something to honor that very thing. And then I realized that's exactly what decadent abbeys and cathedrals and churches, Catholic churches, are. They are essentially an outer expression of an inner faith, that they want to respect something that Jesus said is real. This is my body. Right? So if we're going to put that in a box or put that in a building, it's going to be a damn good building. Oh, sorry, that's an Australian word that means nothing. So I understand that. I understand that's a swear word in America, but it means nothing in Australia. Sorry, I apologise. It's got to be a really good building, right? Like it's got to be something that demonstrates my devotion to the body and blood of Christ. And now I understand that things like a Gothic cathedral or a monstrance, which is something that at the end of the Mass, the sacrament, which is the bread or the wafer, is placed in, because it's not just bread anymore. It's been used in a beautiful tradition of worship, right? So it's not just bread anymore. It is something that we used to remember Christ. Now, if that's something we just use, we're not going to just chuck it in the bin. We're going to honor what Christ did by thinking about it, right? And so that's everything that I used to rubbish and laugh at, such as a monstrance or a cathedral, is now something that I really respect, because it's not heartless. It's completely heartfelt. So that's how I would explain it to Protestants now, and I often do come into conversations with Protestants, because when they find out that I've been sitting in a Catholic church and praying, they go, "Isn't that just idolatry and necromancy and all this other claims that I used to say?" And I go, no, it isn't. It's much more than that. But I understand you're on a different journey. But this is my journey. I've realized that it isn't as evil as I thought it was, or it's vastly different. It's actually beautiful and heartfelt. Yeah.
I couldn't help but think that if we took the relics of Saint Foy, for example, and the way that you transmit this story, that there is something about power within the remains. And that's, whatever item it is, it's holding the relic at the time. I mean, what does that say about this belief itself? I mean, is it a faith that makes them powerful, or is it fear?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And to be fair, like, my book is fictional, and it is a secular book. It is it is not a Christian book, and it is not a Catholic book. So some people might find what I've written incorrect or offensive, and I take that. But I've read a lot of books, fiction and non-fiction, around medieval spirituality, particularly 11th century. And yes, for some people, a lot of people, it was a transaction. For a lot of people, it was a transaction thing, and it controlled the imagination rather than the faith. And rather than it also controlled the imagination more so than their belief in God's benevolence for them. And I guess my book does tap on that, and does it has a number of characters in there which I love, that have a balanced view on what a relic should do for one's faith. And they're the people I want people to focus on when they read my book. A particular abbot named Edwin is a bit of a mystic, but awesome, and I want to be like him. And I think that he's the only balanced character in there, because it's fiction. I want people to be messed up because it makes for good reading. But I didn't want this book to be a stumbling block for anyone who is of a faith or who isn't of any faiths. I wanted this to just be a reproduction of what I've studied. And I am by no means a professor, but I am fascinated by this particular point in time because it's pre-Crusade, it's pre-Reformation, and it's of a particularly awesome time in spirituality where people could see it as just part of their family, or they could see it as part of their heart. So, yeah.
I mean, today, see, that's the thing is when you're looking at mysticism, and you're coming across these kind of words, the modern Christian thinks mysticism, and you're saying things like Gupta or Buddha, or you're even saying something like Alan Watts or a handful of these other, self-help kind of people that spawned up in the 70s, for example, and
Shirley MacLaine.
Shirley MacLaine. These are all, this is all mysticism.
Yeah.
But that's the thing, though. So we picture the 11th century mysticism itself seemed to basically bleed into every crack of the medieval world.
Yes, of course.
And so, I mean, was it? It was clearly more than just private and monistic, but how was it experienced for the people in the time that 11th century that you found in your research?
I mean, that's a very long stick, so or a very long piece of string, because it for the average farmer, they just wanted to get to Sunday because they had a level of faith where they just feel that they felt connected to Christ by going to church and looking at the stained glass windows or whatever and understanding the passion and seeing the elevation of the sacrament. So, but on the other end of the stick, there were monks that had no faith at all. There were monks that just turned up at a monastery because they were escaping starvation or even debt collectors. So they had no faith, and they would just be there because they were getting fed every day, and they just had to get up early in the morning. But there were monastics and also lay people, particularly women. Every time I read about 11th century spirituality, a lot of it's women, because there's an amazing author and professor, Eamon Duffy, who I just love and is just an enormous inspiration for me. He's written a number of books around prayer books, which is around that time it was called the Book of the Hours, or Hore, which is in Latin. And the reason we know so much about women is because women owned them. They owned a lot of these Book of the Hours. And in the Book of the Hours, it's very similar to current day prayer books in the Catholic faith, but it had a lot less stuff. It would just have a Psalter, which is just the most of the Psalms. It would have the little hours of the Blessed Virgin, which is some things that have been kept today, and then it would have a few prayers with some rubrics attached to them. And these ladies, so they were noble because they were wealthy enough to own them. They would leave notes, and they would make notes in there, in who they were praying for and things like that. And there's a book. There's a number of books that Eamon Duffy has written around that spirituality, understanding the notes, and that is an insight and a window to the type of faith that these particularly women would have. And I don't know, I took a lot from that, and I probably didn't write about it enough, is how much daily prayer meant to them. Not just what they were praying or when, but it had to be daily. And they wouldn't even go downstairs and eat until they finished their morning prayers, and then after lunch they would be upstairs again. And then they would be at Mass in the morning, the next morning, and then they would come home and do the daily repetition and the daily practice and the discipline of that was a big part of their faith, but they probably did it when they didn't want to do it. They probably did it sometimes to show off that they were, but a lot of them probably did it because they just felt that they want to be close to Christ. And I took a lot of inspiration from that. I really did.
Yeah, there's this idea that if you have a prayer request, you find the little old ladies that sit in the back of the church praying the rosary. It's kind of a
100%.
kind of a funny thing to say, but there's something there.
Yes, 100%. I couldn't agree more.
So you pose, if we go back to your novel here, you pose this really unsettling question, and that's, Was William the Conqueror orchestrating these events himself, or was he being used by the Relic, basically by Saint Foy herself? And so basically, you take this theological thriller, and it's married to a war epic, and you have this strategy. How is it that you present this question? How do you come up with this idea that there may be more power in the remains of our saints than there is for the William the Conqueror?
I do. I look at the only reason I do that and to be fair on you, what you're talking about there. There's a number of apparitions that take place in my book, and the only reason I do that comfortably is because in the story of Foy's Passion, there is a 9th century, pretty reliable, not completely reliable, but a pretty reliable story of her passion, of her martyrdom. And at the end of her martyrdom, there is an apparition experienced by her priest, and I use that as a measuring stick for subsequent apparitions. Is that saints, and my understanding, which is still very young in the Catholic faith, are guides by their own life, and they are intercessors. I guess my story touches on both of those things. The apparition of a saint is not completely unknown. It has happened, but they're all pointing to Jesus, and I don't want to stress that strong. I can't stress that strongly enough. But I guess I did use that as a mysticism or a mystical or paranormal thriller type way. Not too fanciful. I didn't go crazy. It's not a Constantine comic, but I didn't go that far. But I did use the idea of a dream or a vision, which suggests that it is Saint Foy, which is a 12-year-old girl, leading people to a stronger faith in Jesus. That's the only way I'd do that, and I try to do it as respectfully as I can. Some people may disagree, but I'm okay with that. Yeah, so I hope I've answered your question there.
That's good. So, I do want to pull on a thread, though. You mentioned, you wanted to do this through a dream, and I have no doubt that over your 12 years of writing this story, that you have come across the deep-seated belief and faith in dreams that are experienced by Catholics in the time. Did you find anything like that interesting?
I never came across in writings or in medieval writings, not just around dreams. I never came across that. I came across modern stories of people's dreams, and that is Catholic and Protestants. So I use that as a guide. So to be completely fair, I have never read anything about mysticism using dreams, apart from Scripture itself with Joseph. But so and plus my own experience, my own faith. Yeah.
Something that I was thinking about, and that is, we talked a little bit earlier about this medieval theft of relics. Did you find that they basically thought this was a justified action? I mean, the 11th century, this is the Vikings are kind of stepping off the stage a little bit. So, I mean, people robbing monasteries was pretty much done by them up until around this time period. So I kind of find, there's this crossing of histories of different kinds of people going on at the same time.
Well, monasteries around that time were not just places of spirituality. They weren't at all. They were like a marketplace. They held power, enormous power within villages. Sometimes a village would be built around a monastery that wasn't there before, just so they can get economic gain from it, like villages, that is. So they would trade with monks. And so monasteries were, enormous, and that's why the dissolution of the monasteries by Henry VIII was a political and economic gain for him, because they were so powerful in England by the time he got into power. So let's back 400 years. Monasteries were overseen by abbots, of course, but they had their own bosses, bishops and archbishops. So there was a huge power to be had there, and wealth to gain. Now, no one was checking in on it, and there was no kind of proper governance around these particular monasteries in France, so on the continent and within England as well. But so a lot of the times they'd be corrupt, and that's pretty cool. That's pretty normal to expect that. A lot of the times they would be corrupt, where you'd have an abbot that didn't really care for spirituality at all. He was just there for political or monetary gain or discomfort. I mean, I'm sure it'd be the same if there were such thing as a Protestant monastery. So you get corrupt monasteries as well. But and the way that they would get their monetary gain is by donations of people when they visited, pilgrims. Pilgrimage was a big part of Christianity or Christendom back then, similar to with Islam today. So Islam, they have 5 pillars. One of them that every Muslim has to do is pilgrimage. It's a similar kind of deal back then in Christianity in the 11th century, is that it was expected that everyone would do pilgrimages, at least locally, and sometimes they would even do it by proxy. So if they were too sick, they would pay for someone else to go, and that they would feel that they completed that. So the pilgrim wouldn't just come with empty pockets. They would come and venerate some sort of reliquary or even an icon, and they would leave some sort of a gift, and that would be seen as the old Hebrew practice of tithe, or it would just be seen as a way of blessing the relic and trying to get their intercession. So I can understand monasteries, if they didn't have a relic, they wouldn't get pilgrims. The pilgrims would only come to get fed, right? And they would leave a small donation. So, but if you had a reliquary and an abbey, then they would leave something a little bit more sizable. And when I tapped into it, as I mentioned, there's this great book on Furta Sacra, and I just couldn't believe it. I found it in so many other places in the history books. The practice of Furta Sacra there's endless evidence about it actually happening, where these monks that had zero conscience, and just when they would go undercover and visit other monasteries and steal their relic and take it back to their own abbot, which is hilarious, but also interesting, fascinating.
No, that's really interesting. I had spoken with a guy who looked at the Shroud of Turin, for example.
Right.
And its rise in France, it's the 14th century, but comes about during the same time that pilgrims are going to Rome to see the Veil of Veronica. That would be the cloth that was used to wipe the face of Jesus during his walk to the Golgotha. And so I'm just thinking about, that's what I'm doing, is I was kind of just picturing this idea that the relics, the saints, the ideas or these items that are held, how do we bring pilgrims to our place? Because pilgrims bring money, and money brings power. And that's really what you were describing is something that's happening in the 11th century that then also is happening in the 14th century. So it would be fair for me to say that it is a continuation. It's something that's been going for a long period of time.
Definitely. Yep. And Santiago de Compostela is the biggest example of that. But no one has stolen those relics. No,
I mean, there's stories. I mean, one that's really funny to me that I've shared is this guy. He comes to this church, St. John Lateran, and he says that I have the skull of John the Baptist, and the guy that's the master of the relics there says we already have the skull of John the Baptist, and the guy says yes, but this was when he was an infant.
That's fantastic. I'd never heard that story. That is brilliant.
And so
I love it.
we have relic peddlers, and that go about really trying their best to convince us that some ignorant person would be like,
that's a great
that's
story.
John the Baptist is a baby. That makes sense.
I've heard something else that there was a comment made in around the Reformation where someone said there's enough relics of the true cross that you could build an abbey.
Yes, they're everywhere. They're everywhere. Yeah. Well, it really sounds like you have this great love for looking into into historical texts. You said fiction or nonfiction, etc. But I mean, this really feels like, even though you're looking at something so far in the past, 1,000 years ago, basically, and you're here now and you're looking back then, what kinds of similarities do you see between the behaviors, the mannerisms, whatever it is today as it is 1,000 years ago?
Yeah, that's a fascinating question. There is a surge of. You go to a Christian bookstore today, like a Protestant Christian bookstore, and it's just chock-a-block full of. It's really funny because it's chock-a-block full of just preachers and stuff writing books. And there is a surge going on in the last, I'd say, 15 years of people digging back into what they're calling ancient practices, but essentially what most of them are is Catholic and Eastern Orthodox practices. So I was that guy, 15 years ago, digging into these interesting ancient practices as a Protestant, going, oh wow, the idea of a liturgical year sounds awesome. It's like a dance that you do every year and you just enjoy it. So the liturgical year, the idea of a liturgical year was the first thing that got me interested in, for me personally, not just for my book, but for me personally, the liturgical year was the first thing that got me interested in practices that existed around the time of my book and exist today and existed long before my book. And then I came across another book called The Saying of the Desert Fathers. So this is less about practice and more about wisdom. And the Desert Fathers, for those who don't know, is a collection of writings from the 3rd century original monastics, starting from obviously St. Anthony, around the 3rd and 4th century. Men and women who escaped normal lives, sold their possessions, and just lived amongst the caves in the desert of Egypt. And there is an enormous amount of writing that was collected, and it is fascinating to read. It really is. The idea of asceticism, the idea of truly taking Jesus' words around, actually believing him and saying, I don't need these possessions. All I need is Christ. So those two things got me started. And then with the idea of the Desert Fathers, I was introduced to something that I believe that not only Eastern Orthodox people use, but Catholics use as well, and that is the practice of a thing called the Jesus Prayer. The Jesus Prayer does have evidence of being practiced as early as the 4th century, where you're repeating the line that the leper said and was told to shut up, which is, Son of David, have mercy on me. But the prayer is, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me. The repetition of that. So that was a big deal for me. The idea of repetition as a Protestant is seen as stupid, foolish, because, Jesus said not to blabber your prayers, like the Pharisees do in the streets. But this is far from that. This is very far from that, and it is not that. It is something where it keeps in constant contact, and it's often referred to as the prayer of the heart, because it becomes a part of your breathing, and it also obeys what St. Paul wrote: pray consistently or pray without ceasing. So that's the biggest one, and ever since then, I'd say 15 years ago, I've been using the Jesus prayer in my daily life. So
yeah, you would have been told all about vain repetition, wouldn't you?
Oh yeah, you better believe it. Absolutely.
Well, if we were to say something to anybody else, I mean, I honestly believe that one is never too old to write a book. It doesn't, there's a story out there that you want to tell, and only you can tell that story. And I think it doesn't matter how old you are, how young you are, but you should get out there and write a story, and whatever inspires you. And clearly you were inspired to look back in time at these historical events and ask these questions. What other advice would you give along those same lines?
Yeah, I guess it is hard to write a book, and it was hard for me. It was difficult because it does throw you, like, there's a saying, no tears in the writer, no tears in the reader. So unless you're experiencing the emotions you're writing about, you're not going to do it in a very good way, and the reader's not going to believe you, and it's going to be rubbish. So as I was writing, I did go through a range of emotions, and at times it did impact my mental health. So it is difficult. And writing, sitting on a computer at 2 a.m. in the morning, it's not awesome. It's not good, right? It's not. But I do think it is important to think about the story that's been stuck in your head that no one else has written and no one else knows about as well. I mean, so for example, my story as being a coda, which is a child of deaf adults, both parents being deaf, that was written beautifully by the story that ended up getting Best Picture, in 2021, I think it was, by the movie named Coda. And that story is very similar to my story. It's actually really, really well written. And I think that is a perfect example of something, a very simple story, which is similar to mine, which opened people's eyes to something they've never known or never seen. And I think it was my journey, or my faith journey, of understanding ancient practices, the Catholic faith, and Eastern Orthodox spirituality. That was a tongue twister. My book is a relic, for lack of a better term, of my journey. But it is a reflection of history, but it is also a bit of a mirror into what's going on in my heart.
No, that's well said. And, we've been talking about your book here a little bit. Why don't you go ahead and plug that and where people could find it or contact you, etc.?
That's a great question. Thanks for that. So my book is called The Conquest of Foy. It was released in October 2021. It took me 12 years to write. If you're interested in historical fiction and with a little bit of paranormal, mysticism, but also a great alternative history to the 1066 story, which everyone knows a lot of, then look up conquestofoy.com. So that's just Conquest of Foy without the .com, or look up The Conquest of Foy on Amazon. It's available in America, UK, and Australia. And it's also available. It was available at Barnes & Noble last time I checked, and it's available at Waterstones in the UK as well. It's something that is a huge part of me. I love talking about it, and I love seeing readers get really inspired by it. And please do reach out and get in contact on my socials, which you'll find on the website, and let me know what you thought of it. Or you can leave a review on Amazon or Goodreads. That always helps.
Always. Thanks, Mark, for coming on the show. I appreciate your time.
My absolute pleasure. Thanks for your time.
Thank you for listening. This is a free podcast based upon the value for value model. If you find value in this, or any episode, you can return that value by liking the show, subscribing to this channel, leaving a review, or sharing with a friend on your social media accounts. You can also donate on my website. Thank you again. This is BT for Truth and Shadow Podcast. You are the light in the darkness.